For a second, it didn't feel like a talk show anymore. The lights were too bright, the crowd was too loud, and Keanu could hear his own heartbeat over the applause as the fan broke through the barrier and rushed toward him. He just finished telling a quiet, funny story about filming in New York when it happened. From the corner of his eye, he saw security hesitate, unsure if this was part of a bit. A woman in a denim jacket, shaking with excitement, slipped past the first guard and stumbled right up to the edge of the stage. The audience thought it was planned. They screamed louder, some stood up with their phones, and the cameras kept rolling. But Keanu's body did something his mind didn't have time to control. He froze. Hands halfway lifted, palms open. His eyes locked on hers like he had just stepped into a moment he could not choreograph or rehearse his way out of. The woman's breath was ragged, her hands trembling as she reached toward him, not quite touching, just hovering. Her face was flushed, eyes wet, split between a hysterical smile and the edge of a sob. For a heartbeat, Keanu saw nothing but fear. Fear that if he moved wrong, if he said the wrong word, this would become another viral clip of a celebrity losing patience. Behind her, the studio audience blurred into a wall of sound, cheers crashing over him like surf. On the desk beside him, Jimmy laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of surprise superfan segment. But his laughter began to fade as he noticed Keanu's expression stiffen, his jaw tighten just a little too much. The fan tried to speak, but only a jumble of words came out. Changed my life. You saved me. I waited years. Interrupted by short, broken breaths. Her eyes darted between Keanu's face and his unmoving hands, and then suddenly she looked ashamed of herself, like she'd woken up in the middle of her own dream with everyone watching. Keanu recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror after interviews where he'd said too much, or not enough, or when he'd walked away from someone who needed more from him than he knew how to give. He wasn't scared of her. He was scared of what this moment would mean for her when the cameras edited it into 15 seconds of entertainment. Security finally began to move in, 2 guards cutting through the audience, their faces stiff and professional, ready to pull her away. The crowd's cheers shifted, some people booing, others laughing, phones raised higher to catch the drama. Keanu's mind raced. If they dragged her off now, she'd go home with nothing but humiliation and a story that painted her as the crazy fan who crossed a line. But if he reached out, if he stepped forward, he knew he was stepping into something far deeper than a quick, photogenic hug. His chest tightened under the black blazer, and for an instant he felt like the studio air had turned thin, too thin to breathe. He could hear Jimmy mumble his name with a half-confused, half-anxious chuckle. Keanu, you good man. Keanu slowly lowered one hand, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on that single movement. Part of him wanted to disappear behind his practiced shyness, to hide behind the familiar shrug and gentle joke that always diffused tension. Another part, quieter but stronger, refused. This wasn't about looking calm on TV. This was about someone who had broken through all the invisible lines because something in her life hurt enough or healed enough to push her this far. He swallowed, his voice caught somewhere between fear and responsibility, and in that fragile, suspended moment, he had to decide whether to protect himself or protect her. And just as he finally opened his mouth to speak, the woman's knees buckled, her body swaying forward as the first security guard grabbed her arm a little too roughly. Her eyes suddenly going wide with panic as she choked out, "Please, don't let them take me away like this." She felt the guard's grip tighten, and for a terrifying second it didn't feel like a TV show anymore. It felt like being dragged out of a life she had only just worked up the courage to step into. Her name was Mia, but in this moment she was no one, just the fan. A shape on a stage, a problem to be removed while people in the audience recorded her humiliation, already smiling at the story they'd tell later. Her legs went weak, a mix of adrenaline, shame, and the dizzy realization that this might be the worst decision she had ever made. For years, she had rehearsed what she might say if she ever met him. Now all she had managed was chaos, shaking hands, and one desperate plea that hung in the bright, merciless studio lights. Keanu's hand shot out before he could think about camera angles or publicist warnings. He didn't grab her, but he held up his palm toward the guard, his voice low but firm. Hey, easy, it's okay." The words slipped out like a reflex, the kind you learn after losing enough people to know how fragile a moment can be. The guard hesitated, caught between training and the unexpected gentleness in Keanu's tone. The audience murmured, tension rippling through the room. Jimmy, perched behind his desk, leaned forward, the smile gone now, eyes flicking from Mia to Keanu to the stage manager waving frantically from the shadows. Mia stared at Keanu, breathing hard, blinking against the tears building in her eyes. She hadn't meant to cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She wanted to be cool, grateful, composed, someone he could look at without flinching. But the combination of fear, lights, and the sudden feeling of being too visible, too exposed, cracked something inside her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I needed to tell you." The words tangled, tripping over each other, and the louder the audience got, the smaller she felt. That same old voice from years earlier came back, the one that had haunted her through lonely nights and therapy waiting rooms. "You're too much. You're making a scene. You're ruining everything." Keanu recognized that battle. He had lived his own version of it, on movie sets when people expected him to be bulletproof, on red carpets when grief pressed against his ribs like invisible fingers. He knew what it was like to hold too many unsaid things in your chest. He looked at Mia and didn't see a crazed fan. He saw someone standing on the thin edge between breaking down and breaking through. Slowly, he shifted in his chair and leaned forward, lowering his hands in a gesture of calm. "Take a breath," he said quietly, not for the cameras, but for her. "You're here now, it's okay." There was no dramatic flourish, no cinematic music, just a tired man trying to give a stranger permission to exist without apology for 30 seconds. In the control room, a producer was shouting about cutting to commercial, about legal liability, about security protocols. On the stage, Jimmy glanced at the audience, then at the main camera, then back to Keanu, torn between the show's rhythm and the raw human moment unfolding inches away from his polished desk. He had seen fans cry before, had participated in countless surprise segments where everything was scripted and safe. This wasn't that. This was messy, unpredictable, and intensely real. For once, he didn't know how to turn it into a joke that would bring the energy back up. He cleared his throat and said softly into his mic, "Let's give her a second," more to the crew than the crowd. Mia's shoulders shook as she tried to steady her breathing, shame burning through her like fever. She could already hear tomorrow's headlines, the comments mocking her, the freeze frame of her tear-streaked face circulating online. Part of her wanted to let the guards take her to disappear to escape this blinding spotlight. But another part, the part that had survived nights when she didn't think she would see morning, refused to go quietly. She swallowed hard, feeling every pair of eyes on her, and forced herself to meet Keanu's gaze. In his expression, she didn't see annoyance or embarrassment. She saw something like recognition, and something she hadn't expected at all, concern. Her voice cracked again, but this time there was a different strength underneath it. You don't know me," she said, each word fighting its way out, "but you kept me alive when I didn't want to be." The audience went strangely quiet at that, the laughter dying mid-breath. Even the guards loosened their hold, just a little confusion flickering across their faces. Jimmy's hand moved to cover his mouth, his eyes softening as the usual showman energy faded into something more vulnerable. Keanu's chest tightened at her confession. He had heard variations of it over the years, messages from strangers, letters slipped into his hands at events, but never like this. Never with an entire studio audience and millions of unseen viewers watching, waiting to see what he would do with a heart that had just been laid bare in front of him. For a long, fragile second that seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the studio, Keanu didn't move. The room held its breath, the cameras hungry, the producers panicking, the audience leaning forward as if they could will the moment into a shape that felt safe. Mia's eyes shone with hope and terror, like she had just thrown the heaviest part of her soul into the air and didn't know if anyone would catch it, or if it would shatter on the studio floor in front of the world. And as that silence deepened, hanging over them with almost physical weight, Keanu realized that whatever he chose to say next would not just define this segment of the show. It might alter the course of Mia's life. Keanu felt the old, familiar ache rise in his chest, the one that came whenever someone thanked him for saving them, as if a movie or a scene could reach into the darkest room of a stranger's mind and pull them back from the edge. He knew what they meant, and he was grateful, but he also knew the truth. He hadn't been there when they cried themselves to sleep, or when they forced themselves out of bed on mornings when nothing felt worth it. They had done that. People like Mia had done the hard work. and then given him the credit because it was easier to thank a face on a screen than to acknowledge their own quiet courage. Under the burning studio lights, he wished he could somehow hand that credit back to her without making this feel like a performance. He shifted forward in his chair, ignoring the subtle hand wave from the stage manager slicing across the air, signaling that they were over time. "Mia, right?" he asked gently, and when she nodded, his voice softened even more. "You kept yourself alive," he said, each word deliberate. "If anything I did helped, I'm grateful, but that strength, that was yours." There was a raw sincerity in his tone that didn't quite fit the polished rhythm of late-night TV. It sounded more like a conversation that should have been happening in a quiet hallway or a back room, not beneath cameras and applause signs. Still, he stayed with her, his eyes locked on hers, refusing to let the pressure of the moment turn her into a sound bite. Mia swallowed, his words cutting through the fog in her head, fighting against the years of self-blame that told her she was weak, ridiculous, broken. Hearing him say it, "You kept yourself alive," hit her harder than she expected. She thought she had come here to thank him, to give something back to the man whose characters had made her feel seen when the world around her seemed determined not to. But now, in front of all these strangers, he was giving something to her instead. A version of herself where she wasn't only a survivor because of someone else's work, but because of her own. It frightened her, how badly she wanted to believe him. In the wings, a producer pressed a headset to his ear and hissed into the mic. "We need to cut this. Jimmy, take us to break. Now." But Jimmy just stared at Mia and Keanu, his instincts as a host colliding with something more human. He knew this wasn't the safe, neat content they usually packaged for late-night viewers. It was messy and unpredictable, and the network wouldn't like it. Yet he also knew that sometimes the best moments on television were the ones that weren't chasing a laugh, but revealing something true. He took a breath, feeling his own heart pick up speed, and made a quiet decision. For once, he wouldn't rush to smooth things over. He leaned back, gave the slightest nod in Keanu's direction, and let the silence stretch. Mia's hands trembled less now, though she still felt the guard's presence at her side, ready to escort her away the second this fragile truce broke. I didn't think I'd ever say that out loud," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "About not wanting to be here." It was as if the words, once spoken, refused to be hauled back into the dark. She stared down at the floor, cheeks burning, waiting for the shame to swallow her. But instead, she heard something unexpected. The crowd's noise had softened into a stillness that almost felt respectful. People shifted in their seats, some lowering their phones, their faces less hungry for drama and more shaken, as if they, too, recognized something of themselves in her confession. Keanu's gaze flickered briefly toward the audience, then back to Mia. He could feel the tension humming through the room like a low electric current, people unsure of where to put their hands, their eyes, their emotions. He knew they were still on television, that millions might be watching, but he couldn't treat this as just a segment anymore. "You don't have to go into detail," he said gently. "You don't owe any of us that, not me, not them." His hand made a small circle, vaguely indicating the crowd and cameras. "You already did the brave part by saying you're still here." The guard at Mia's elbow shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the wings for further instruction. He'd been trained to de-escalate, to remove potential threats, not to stand quietly while a woman poured out her pain in front of celebrities and strangers. Yet something in Keanu's steady calm, and the way Mia clung to his words like a rope, made it hard to justify yanking her away. He eased his grip without quite realizing it, his hand resting more as support than restraint. It was a small, almost invisible act of kindness, but Mia felt it, felt that the room was no longer trying to push her out, at least not in this exact second. "I used to watch your movies," Mia said, her voice growing a fraction steadier, "because your characters, they hurt, but they still kept going, even when they lost everything." Her throat tightened around the last word. "It made me think maybe I could, too." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away this time. There was no point pretending she hadn't reached the edge. She already had. "I just wanted to say thank you, but I didn't know how without making a mess of it." Keanu's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "I make a mess of things all the time," he said softly. "You're in good company." The audience chuckled quietly, but it wasn't the explosive laughter the show usually thrived on. It was something gentler, almost protective. For the first time since she'd stepped onto the stage, Mia felt less like a spectacle and more like a human being in a room of other human beings, all of them carrying more than they ever said out loud. And then, just as the air began to settle, as it seemed like this fragile, unexpected moment of connection might find a soft landing, a sharp voice cut through from the darkness beyond the cameras. Someone from the crew, forgetting they were still hot, snapping, "We have to get her off stage now." The mic caught it, the audience heard it, and Mia's brief sense of safety shattered like glass, her body flinching as though she'd been struck, her eyes flying back to Keanu in panic as the guard's grip tightened once more. The words slammed into the room like a door being kicked open. Mia's spine stiffened, every instinct screaming that this was the part where they yanked her away, where the warmth of the last few minutes would be rewritten as a security incident. The guard's hand tightened again on her arm, not cruelly, but firmly, and the fragile calm that had been building inside her began to crack. She could already see it. The headlines, the edits that cut out the quiet parts and left only the chaos, the comments calling her unstable, attention-seeking, crazy. Her chest constricted, breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, she wished she had never stood up at all. Keanu's jaw tensed. That one sharp command from the dark felt like the world trying to snap this moment back into its usual shape, a neat, controlled show where real feelings got trimmed in the edit. Before the guard could move her, Keanu stood up. It was a simple action, but it shifted everything. He wasn't towering or aggressive. He just stepped between Mia and the faceless voice, placing himself in the center of the frame. His posture was calm, but there was a quiet finality in it that made even the stage crew hesitate. The applause sign didn't light up, but some people in the audience clapped anyway, unsure why, only knowing they were watching something they didn't usually see on television. A man choosing discomfort over convenience. He turned slightly toward the cameras, but his words were meant for the people in the room. "We'll be okay," he said, steady and clear. "We can take a minute." He looked at Jimmy, giving him a chance to pull rank, to pivot, to turn this into a bit. Instead, Jimmy nodded, eyes serious, one hand lifted as if to physically wave off the pressure coming through his earpiece. "Yeah," Jimmy said into his mic, voice softer than his usual on-screen tone. We're gonna stay here for a second." Somewhere in the control room, someone cursed, but in the studio, a low murmur of agreement rolled through the seats like a tide. Mia felt the guard's grip loosen again, this time more decisively. Her knees still shook, but now it wasn't from pure fear. It was from the weight of realizing she wasn't being thrown away, not yet. Keanu turned back to her, his expression gentling once more. "Mia," he said quietly, "you've said what you came to say. That took courage." He paused, giving the word room to land. "Now I want you to do something for me, okay?" She sniffed, confused, wiping at her cheeks. "For you," she echoed, as if the idea didn't quite make sense. "For me," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper now. "I want you to walk off this stage knowing you weren't a problem. You were a person being honest. Can you do that?" The phrasing caught her off guard. She had spent so much of her life apologizing for existing too loudly that the suggestion she could leave without shame felt almost impossible. But the way he said it, patient, hopeful, like he believed she could carry that version of the story with her, made something warm break open in her chest. She nodded slowly, tears spilling again, but this time they felt different. Less like collapse, more like release. The audience watched, many holding their breath, some with eyes glistening. A woman in the third row clasped her hands together under her chin, silently urging Mia to hold on. A man near the back lowered his phone entirely, suddenly ashamed that his first instinct had been to record. He slipped the device into his pocket and just looked, present in a way he hadn't intended to be when he walked into a late-night taping. The energy in the studio had shifted from giddy excitement to something profoundly human, and no one quite knew what to do with it except witness. Mia inhaled shakily, feeling the guard's hand transform from a restraint into light support at her elbow. She looked at Keanu one last time, memorizing the kindness in his eyes, the way he wasn't trying to fix her, just to honor the fragile bravery it had taken for her to unravel in public. "Thank you," she whispered, the words threaded with a different meaning now. Not just thank you for the movies or the characters or the memories that had kept her company in the dark. Thank you for not letting this moment turn into another reason for her to hate herself. Keanu gave a small nod, his own eyes glimmering with emotions he didn't bother to hide. "Thank you for staying," he replied. It was simple, but it hit her with almost physical force. Not thank you for watching me, not thank you for being a fan, thank you for staying, for surviving, for choosing to still be here even when it would have been easier not to. The crowd didn't erupt into applause right away. There was a heartbeat of silence, as if everyone needed to catch up to what they'd just heard. Then slowly, people began to clap. Not the wild, performative cheering of earlier, but a deeper, more grounded applause that wrapped around Mia as she turned to leave the stage. As the guard gently guided her down the steps, Jimmy stood as well, breaking the usual distance of the desk. He called after her, his tone warm and unpolished. "Mia," he said, "you did good tonight." She looked back over her shoulder, eyes wide with surprise, and saw not the sparkling late-night persona, but a man who understood, at least a little, how heavy some nights could feel. She gave a small, trembling smile, then disappeared into the dim corridor beyond the hot glare of the lights. Back on stage, Keanu sat down slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Jimmy settled into his chair beside him, both men unusually quiet. The audience, sensing the delicate nature of the moment, stayed hushed. Jimmy glanced at Keanu, then at the camera, then back again, searching for the right way to move forward without dishonoring what had just happened. Finally, he said, "We'll be right back," but his usual playful cadence was gone. Instead, the words felt like an acknowledgement, a promise that they wouldn't clip this into something smaller than it was. The show cut to commercial, but in living rooms and on phones across the world, people would later watch the full, unedited moment. The trembling girl in the denim jacket, the actor who chose presence over polish, the host who didn't rush to the punchline. Some viewers would see themselves in Mia's shaken confession. Others would feel a quiet challenge in Keanu's steady insistence that survival belonged first to the person who fought for it. A few would scoff, but many more would sit in a strange, reflective silence they hadn't expected from a late-night show. As for Mia, she walked out of the studio into the cool night air, the city humming around her, her heart still racing but no longer collapsing in on itself. The familiar voice in her head tried, half-heartedly, to twist the evening into another story of embarrassment and failure. But over it, stronger than it had ever been, she heard Keanu's words replaying in her mind. "You kept yourself alive. You weren't a problem. You were a person being honest." And for the first time in a very long time, as she stepped into the dark with the city lights spreading out before her like a scattered constellation, she felt something she hadn't dared to name in years. Not just relief that she had survived another day, but a flicker of genuine, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to keep going, not as a burden to the world, but as someone who had earned her place in it.